In 2017, a team of geologists published a paper in the journal GSA Today that proposed something that should have been impossible: the discovery of a new continent. Not a new island. Not a previously unmapped seamount. A continent. The 8th continent on Earth. Larger than India. Larger than Greenland. Larger than any landmass that had been unknown to science since the age of exploration. And the reason no one had recognized it as a continent before was not that it was hidden in some inaccessible corner of the ocean. It was that 94% of it was underwater. The continent is called Zealandia. Its exposed portion includes New Zealand, New Caledonia, and a scattering of smaller islands in the southwestern Pacific. But beneath the ocean surface, extending from the Loyalty Islands in the north to the Campbell Plateau in the south, and from the Lord Howe Rise in the west to the Chatham Rise in the east, lies a single continuous fragment of continental crust approximately 4.9 million square kilometers in area, roughly the size of Australia or the contiguous United States west of the Mississippi. It is geologically distinct from the oceanic crust of the surrounding Pacific and Indian Oceans, composed of lighter granitic rock that sits higher on the mantle than the basaltic rock of the ocean floors. It has mountains and valleys, rivers and basins, a geological history extending back more than 500 million years. It is, by every geological criterion, a continent. It has simply been below sea level for the last 80 million years, and nobody counted it. Subscribe now and stay for the next journey. Every week, a new documentary designed for the dark hours, for the curious, for anyone who wants to fall asleep knowing something they did not know when they woke up. The story of how Zealandia came to be underwater is, in its way, one of the most dramatic in the geological history of the Earth. It begins with Gondwana, the great southern supercontinent that assembled roughly 550 million years ago and that for the next 250 million years dominated the southern hemisphere, connecting what would eventually become Antarctica, Australia, South America, Africa, India, Arabia, and the landmass that would become Zealandia into a single enormous continent. During the Cretaceous period, approximately 150 to 80 million years ago, Gondwana began to break apart, its fragments separating and drifting toward their current positions on the Earth's surface. Australia separated from Antarctica. India began its extraordinary journey north toward the Tethys Ocean. And the fragment that would become Zealandia separated from the eastern margin of Gondwana and began to drift east into the Pacific. What made Zealandia's fate different from that of the other Gondwana fragments was what happened after its separation. As it moved east, the continental crust of Zealandia was stretched. The stretching thinned the crust, reducing its thickness from the typical 40 to 50 kilometers of mature continental crust to an average of 20 to 25 kilometers in much of Zealandia. And thinner crust sits lower on the mantle than thick crust, in the same way that a thinner piece of wood floats lower in water than a thick one. As the crust thinned, Zealandia sank. Not suddenly, not catastrophically, but gradually, over tens of millions of years, slipping below the waves until only the highest peaks remained above the surface as the islands we know today. The geological evidence for Zealandia as a continent, rather than simply a collection of submerged continental fragments, has been accumulating for decades, but the 2017 paper represented the first systematic attempt to compile that evidence into a coherent case for continent status. The specific moment in the geological record when Zealandia finally slipped below the surface of the ocean is not precisely known, because the transition was not instantaneous and because it occurred at different times in different parts of the continent. The Campbell Plateau in the south appears to have submerged earlier than the regions closer to New Zealand in the north. The Lord Howe Rise to the northwest may have had exposed land for longer than the flatter southern portions. And the region that eventually became the New Zealand Alps remained above water throughout, though what is now the highest terrain in New Zealand was, during most of the Cenozoic, low-lying land rather than the dramatic mountains that define the South Island today. The pattern of submergence was therefore complex and spatially variable, reflecting the uneven stretching and thinning of the crust during the rifting from Gondwana. The concept of a drowned continent is not unique to Zealandia, but Zealandia is by far the largest and best documented example. The geological literature contains numerous references to microcontinents, continental fragments, and elevated plateaus of continental affinity that are partially or fully submerged, scattered across every ocean basin. What distinguishes Zealandia from those other features is its size and its geological coherence. It is large enough and internally consistent enough to constitute a single geological entity, rather than a collection of separate fragments. The recognition of Zealandia as a continent, therefore, has implications beyond New Zealand. It suggests that the inventory of the world's continents may not be complete, and that other large submerged continental masses may be awaiting recognition in other parts of the global ocean. The definition of a continent is less precise than most people assume. There is no universally agreed scientific definition that specifies exactly how large a piece of continental crust must be, or how geologically distinct, or how structurally coherent, before it qualifies as a continent. The traditional seven-continent model, which is the most familiar to English speakers, is based on a combination of geological, geographical, and cultural criteria that are not entirely consistent with each other. Europe and Asia share a continuous landmass and are geologically part of the same tectonic plate, yet they are counted as separate continents. Australia is both a continent and a country. Antarctica is a continent, even though it is entirely covered in ice and has no permanent human population. The criteria are pragmatic rather than rigorous. The geologists who proposed Zealandia as a continent in 2017 applied a set of 4 criteria. Elevation above the surrounding ocean floor, which indicates the presence of thicker, lighter continental crust rather than denser oceanic basalt, the geology of the rocks, which in Zealandia includes granitic and metamorphic rocks characteristic of continental crust rather than the basaltic rocks of ocean islands, the crustal thickness and structure as measured by seismic surveys and gravity measurements, and the area and structural coherence of the proposed continent, which must be large enough and sufficiently continuous to qualify as a distinct geological entity rather than a fragment or a microcontinent. On all 4 criteria, Zealandia qualifies. Its rocks are continental in composition. Its crust is thicker than oceanic crust. Its area of 4.9 million square kilometers is larger than that of the smallest currently recognized continent, Australia, at approximately 7.7 million square kilometers when the continental shelf is excluded, and while Zealandia is smaller than Australia, its authors argued that the difference in size does not justify a difference in classification, any more than the difference in size between Asia and Australia justifies treating one as a continent and the other as an island. The argument was geological, not political or cultural, and on geological grounds it was difficult to refute. The response to the paper was initially skeptical in some quarters, largely because the concept of discovering a new continent seemed too dramatic to be credible. But the geological community gradually accepted the evidence, and by the early 2020s, Zealandia was being incorporated into geological databases and reference materials as the 8th continent. The International Hydrographic Organization updated its oceanic reference data to reflect the new understanding of the seafloor topography around Zealandia. Google Maps updated its topographic displays to show the submerged plateau more clearly. The scientific consensus, while not unanimous, had shifted decisively toward acceptance. The geological history of Zealandia, which extends back more than 500 million years, is a story of repeated assembly, deformation, and dispersal that parallels the broader history of the Southern Hemisphere. The oldest rocks of Zealandia, exposed in the Fiordland region of New Zealand's South Island and in parts of Antarctica that were once connected to it, are metamorphic rocks dating to the Cambrian period, approximately 500 million years ago. Those ancient rocks record the conditions of the deep crust during the assembly of Gondwana, when the land masses that would eventually form the southern supercontinent were being sutured together along mountain building zones that produced rocks of extreme temperature and pressure. The Fjordland metamorphics, some of the most thoroughly studied deep crustal rocks in the southern hemisphere, preserve a record of processes that occurred at depths of 40 kilometers or more beneath the surface of the ancient Earth, where temperatures exceeded 800 degrees Celsius and pressures were equivalent to those at the bottom of a stack of rock 30 kilometers high. The subsequent history of the Zealandian crust through the Paleozoic and Mesozoic eras was one of repeated accretion, where successive terrains, fragments of crust with distinct geological histories, were added to the growing continental margin as the oceanic plates of the Proto-Pacific were subducted beneath the eastern margin of Gondwana. Each terrain brought its own package of rocks, fossils, and geological structures, and the complex patchwork of terrains that makes up the basement of New Zealand today is the accumulated record of 300 million years of continental growth at the margin of the ancient supercontinent. The sedimentary basins of the submerged Zealandian plateau have been of considerable interest to the petroleum industry, which has conducted extensive seismic surveys of the region over the past 50 years in search of commercially viable hydrocarbon accumulations. Those surveys, which were primarily conducted for economic purposes, produced a large body of data about the structure and thickness of the sedimentary sequences on the plateau that has been invaluable for the scientific understanding of the geological history of the region. The Great South Basin, located to the south of the South Island of New Zealand, is the largest of the submerged sedimentary basins, and it contains thick sequences of Cretaceous and Cenozoic sediments that have been the target of several exploratory drilling campaigns. While large-scale commercial hydrocarbon production from the Great South Basin has not materialized, the scientific data from those drilling campaigns has significantly advanced the understanding of the Cretaceous rifting history of Zealandia. The thermal history of the Zealandian lithosphere, the cool, rigid outer layer of the Earth that includes the crust and the uppermost mantle, has been studied through a combination of surface geology, heat flow measurements, and geophysical modeling. The stretching that thinned the Zealandian crust also thinned the lithosphere, bringing hot mantle material closer to the surface and increasing the heat flow through the crust. That elevated heat flow, which is still measurable in parts of New Zealand today, drove the geothermal activity of the volcanic regions and accelerated the subsidence of the plateau by reducing the buoyancy of the lithosphere. As the lithosphere cooled over tens of millions of years, it contracted and became denser, causing additional subsidence independent of the crustal thinning. The combination of thinning and cooling subsidence is what produced the profound submergence of most of the Zealandian platform. The Cretaceous separation of Zealandia from Gondwana was preceded by a period of intense igneous activity along the developing rift zone. As the continental crust began to stretch and thin, magmas from the mantle below intruded upward through the thinning crust, producing a series of large igneous bodies that are now exposed in the ranges of New Zealand and on the Lord Howe Rise. Those igneous rocks, which include both intrusive granites and extrusive volcanic rocks, document the timing and the character of the rifting process in considerable detail. The rifting itself was asymmetric. The separation between Australia and Zealandia, and between Zealandia and Antarctica, proceeded at different rates and in different directions, producing a complex pattern of spreading centers and transform faults that is still being unraveled by marine geologists studying the seafloor topography of the Tasman Sea and the southwestern Pacific. The Tasman Sea, which separates Australia from New Zealand and is approximately 4,000 kilometers wide, opened entirely during the Cretaceous and early Paleogene, between approximately 83 and 53 million years ago, in a geologically rapid spreading event that separated the two pieces of former Gondwana and established the geography of the southwestern Pacific. The drowning of Zealandia was not a simple process of gradual subsidence following the thinning of the crust. The geological record preserved in the sediments and rocks of New Zealand and the surrounding submerged plateaus tells a more complex story, involving alternating periods of relative emergence and submergence driven by changes in sea level, in tectonic activity, and in the thermal state of the underlying mantle. The fossil record of Zealandia provides some of the most compelling evidence for the history of its submergence. During the Eocene epoch, approximately 50 million years ago, much of what is now the submerged plateau of Zealandia appears to have been exposed as land, supporting ecosystems of plants and animals that have left their traces in the fossil record. The discovery of fossil pollen, spores, and plant fragments in sedimentary rocks that are now on the seafloor confirms that terrestrial vegetation grew on the surface of Zealandia before it sank. The presence of those fossils, preserved in sediments deposited in shallow marine and coastal environments, tells us that the transition from terrestrial to marine environments was gradual rather than catastrophic. The lowest point of Zealandia's submergence appears to have occurred during the Oligocene epoch, approximately 25 to 30 million years ago, when sea level was high and the tectonic forces that would eventually push the New Zealand Alps upward had not yet taken effect. At that time, Zealandia may have been almost entirely underwater, with only a few scattered shallow banks and seamounts breaking the surface. The implications of that near-total submergence for the terrestrial fauna and flora of Zealandia are profound, and they explain some of the most distinctive features of the modern New Zealand biome. New Zealand is famous for its unusual fauna, characterized by the near-total absence of terrestrial mammals aside from bats and the unusual dominance of birds, including many flightless species, in the ecological roles that mammals fill on other continents. The standard explanation is that New Zealand separated from Gondwana before terrestrial mammals had diversified, leaving the continent free of mammalian predators and competitors and allowing birds to evolve to fill ecological niches that mammals occupy elsewhere. But the near-total submergence of Zealandia during the Oligocene complicates that explanation. If Zealandia was almost entirely underwater 25 million years ago, then the terrestrial life of modern New Zealand cannot be descended from organisms that continuously inhabited the landmass since the Cretaceous separation from Gondwana. It must have colonized the emergent portion of Zealandia from elsewhere, by sea or by air, after the Oligocene low stand. The resolution of that puzzle, which has occupied New Zealand biogeographers and paleontologists for decades, involves a combination of dispersal from Australia and other Pacific islands, the possible survival of some terrestrial organisms on high ground during the Oligocene submergence, and the extraordinary diversification of the colonizing lineages in the absence of mammalian competition. The result is a biota that is unique in the world, a living laboratory of island evolution that has produced organisms found nowhere else, from the tuatara, the sole surviving member of an ancient reptile order, to the kiwi, the nocturnal flightless bird that has evolved a metabolism and a lifestyle more reminiscent of a mammal than of most birds. The paleoclimatic significance of Zealandia extends beyond the geological record preserved in its own sediments. The position of the Zealandian plateau at mid-latitudes in the southern hemisphere means that the uplift and subsidence of that plateau have affected the circulation patterns of the Southern Ocean and the distribution of sea surface temperatures in the southwestern Pacific throughout the Cenozoic. When the plateau was relatively elevated, it would have deflected the Antarctic circumpolar current and altered the pattern of deep water formation in the surrounding ocean. When it subsided, the circulation would have reorganized. Those changes in ocean circulation would have had downstream effects on global climate through their influence on the transport of heat from the tropics to the poles and on the sequestration of carbon dioxide in the deep ocean. Understanding those effects requires the kind of detailed paleoceanographic record that the sediment cores of Zealandia are beginning to provide. The international scientific interest in Zealandia reflects its importance as a natural laboratory for studying processes that are of broad geological relevance. Continental rifting, subduction initiation, arc magmatism, and the transition from continental to oceanic crust are all occurring or have recently occurred in the Zealandian region, making it a place where the full range of plate tectonic processes can be studied in a relatively small geographic area. The data from Zealandia are therefore relevant not just to the geology of New Zealand but to the understanding of those processes in other parts of the world where they are active. Scientists from Europe, North America, Asia, and Australia, as well as from New Zealand and Australia, participate in the ongoing research programs focused on Zealandia, reflecting the global significance of the geological questions it poses. The active tectonics of Zealandia, which drives the seismicity and volcanism of New Zealand and the surrounding region, provides a striking contrast with the geological tranquility of the submerged plateaus to the northwest. The boundary between the Australian and Pacific tectonic plates runs through Zealandia, passing beneath New Zealand in a complex zone of collision, subduction, and transform faulting that has been responsible for some of the most dramatic geological events in the southwestern Pacific over the last 10 million years. The collision between the two plates has been uplift the New Zealand Alps, building mountains that now rise to more than 3,000 meters above sea level from a plateau that was, 20 million years ago, essentially at sea level. That rate of uplift, several millimeters per year, is among the highest in the world, and it is matched by an equally impressive rate of erosion as the uplifting rocks are attacked by the rivers and glaciers of a wet maritime climate. The subduction of the Pacific Plate beneath the Australian Plate on the northeastern margin of New Zealand has produced the Tonga Kermatic Trench, one of the deepest oceanic trenches on Earth, reaching depths of more than 10 kilometers. That subduction has also produced the volcanic arc that includes Tonga, Samoa, and the Kermatic Islands, as well as a series of submarine volcanoes on the northeastern margin of Zealandia. The contrast between the actively sinking Pacific Plate on the northeastern side and the slowly rising New Zealand Alps on the southwestern side is one of the most geologically dramatic in the world, producing in a relatively small area examples of virtually every tectonic process that operates on Earth's surface. The hydrothermal activity associated with the volcanic arc on the northeastern margin of Zealandia creates some of the most productive hydrothermal vent ecosystems in the southern hemisphere. The vents at Kermatic Ridge, which have been studied by oceanographic expeditions since the 1980s, support communities of tube worms, shrimp, and other organisms adapted to the extreme conditions of hot, chemically enriched water seeping from the volcanic seafloor. Those communities are of considerable scientific interest both for their biodiversity and for what they reveal about the distribution of hydrothermal ecosystems in the Pacific, but they are also essentially inaccessible to conventional scientific study because of the depth at which they occur and the remoteness of the location. The seismicity of New Zealand is a direct consequence of the tectonic complexity of Zealandia's plate boundary zone. New Zealand experiences more earthquakes per square kilometer than almost any other populated region on Earth. The 2011 Christchurch earthquake, which killed 185 people and devastated the city centre, was caused by a fault on the Canterbury Plains that was not known to be active before it ruptured. That earthquake was a reminder that the tectonic forces operating beneath Zealandia are not merely geological abstractions but immediate and sometimes lethal realities for the people who live on the exposed portion of the continent. The scientific exploration of the submerged portions of Zealandia represents one of the most ambitious ongoing geological investigations in the southwestern Pacific. The International Ocean Discovery Program, which coordinates deep-sea drilling expeditions around the world, conducted a major drilling campaign in the waters around Zealandia in 2017, the same year as the publication of the Continent Recognition Paper. That campaign, Expedition 371, drilled at 6 sites across the Zealandian Plateau and retrieved sediment cores extending back more than 80 million years, providing the most complete record of the geological history of the submerged continent that had ever been obtained. The Zealandian volcanic systems are among the most active and most diverse in the southwestern Pacific. The North Island of New Zealand sits above a subduction zone where the Pacific Plate is descending beneath the Australian Plate, and the magmas generated by the melting of the subducting plate have produced a volcanic arc that includes the Taupo volcanic zone, one of the most productive silicic volcanic systems on Earth. The Taupo eruption of approximately 1800 years ago was the most violent volcanic eruption on Earth in the last 5,000 years, ejecting more than 100 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere and devastating an area of thousands of square kilometers. The caldera lake that now occupies the eruption site is the largest lake in New Zealand and one of the largest calderas in the world. Future eruptions of comparable or greater magnitude are a certainty in geological time. The only question is when. The archaeology of New Zealand provides a different kind of window into the history of the Zealandian region during the recent geological past. The midden sites, carved wood, and other material culture left by the first Maori inhabitants of New Zealand document the exploitation of the marine and terrestrial resources of the islands during the 7 centuries of human occupation, providing a baseline for understanding how those resources have changed over time. The extinction of the large flightless moa birds, which occurred within a few centuries of the Polynesian settlement of New Zealand, was one of the most significant human-caused extinctions in the southern hemisphere, and the ecological cascades triggered by that extinction reshaped the terrestrial ecosystems of New Zealand in ways that are still being assessed. The Haast's eagle, the largest eagle that ever lived, which preyed on the moa, also became extinct when its prey was eliminated, leaving a gap at the apex of the food chain that no other species has filled. The cores recovered by Expedition 371 contained a remarkable archive of the changing environments of Zealandia since its separation from Gondwana. The oldest sediments in the cores, deposited in the immediate aftermath of the Cretaceous separation, contained pollen and spores of terrestrial plants, confirming that the surface of Zealandia was above sea level during the initial stages of its separation from Gondwana. Higher in the cores, the sediments transitioned to shallow marine deposits, then to deeper water carbonates, tracking the progressive submergence of the continent over tens of millions of years. And interspersed throughout the sequence were layers of volcanic ash from the eruptions that accompanied the tectonic history of the region, each layer precisely dated and providing a chronological framework for the entire sedimentary record. One of the most significant findings of Expedition 371 was evidence for a dramatic tectonic reorganization in the southwestern Pacific approximately 50 million years ago. The sediments from that period show a sudden change in the direction of movement of the Zealandian continental fragment and a reorganization of the subduction zones and spreading centers around it. That event, which is also recorded in the magnetic anomaly patterns of the surrounding oceanic crust, appears to have been the result of a fundamental reorganization of Pacific plate tectonics, possibly triggered by the collision of India with Eurasia, which changed the force balance between the tectonic plates throughout the Indo-Pacific region. The discovery of that tectonic reorganization was important not just for understanding the history of Zealandia, but for understanding the broader plate tectonic history of the Pacific. The southwestern Pacific has been one of the most poorly understood regions of global plate tectonics, partly because of the complexity of the plate boundary system and partly because of the lack of data from the deep-sea sediment record. The cores from Expedition 371 provided data that allowed researchers to reconstruct the tectonic history of the region in a level of detail that had not previously been possible, and the results challenged some of the assumptions built into existing models of Pacific plate tectonics. The biological history of Zealandia is as fascinating as its geological history, and the two are intimately connected. The organisms that lived on Zealandia during its above-water phases have left their traces in the fossil record, and those traces tell a story of repeated colonization, diversification, and extinction driven by the alternating periods of emergence and submergence. During the Cretaceous, when Zealandia was still connected to or recently separated from Gondwana, the continent harbored a diverse biota that included dinosaurs, early mammals, and a rich assemblage of plants. Fossil dinosaur bones have been recovered from New Zealand, though the specimens are fragmentary and their taxonomic identification is difficult. Fossil mammal teeth from the Cretaceous of New Zealand, though extremely rare, indicate the presence of small mammals on the continent before it became isolated. The subsequent history of the Zealandian biota through the Eocene and Oligocene was one of progressive simplification as the continent sank and the terrestrial habitats were reduced to islands and eventually to little more than elevated banks on the seafloor. The organisms that survived that progressive loss of habitat were those that could either fly, float, or disperse across open ocean, and the modern biota of New Zealand reflects that filter, birds, bats, lizards, frogs, and insects, all capable of long-distance dispersal, are well represented, while the large terrestrial mammals that dominate the faunas of other continents are entirely absent. The tuatara deserves special mention as one of the most extraordinary living fossils that Zealandia has preserved. The tuatara, which looks superficially like a lizard but is actually the sole survivor of an ancient reptile order called Rhynchocephalia, was once distributed across Gondwana during the Mesozoic era. Its relatives are known from fossil sites in Europe, North America, and Africa as well as Gondwana, but they all became extinct on those continents during or after the Cretaceous, leaving the tuatara isolated in New Zealand as the last of its kind. The tuatara's physiology is unusual in several respects. It is most active at temperatures well below those preferred by most lizards. It has a slow metabolic rate that allows it to live for over 100 years, and it has a third eye on top of its head, a vestigial but functional photosensory organ that is thought to help regulate its circadian rhythms. The tuatara is, in a very real sense, a living window into the Triassic period, an organism whose body plan has changed very little since the age of the dinosaurs. The deep-sea coral ecosystems of the submerged Zealandian plateau are among the most scientifically interesting and most poorly understood marine ecosystems in the southern hemisphere. Deep-sea corals, which are distinct from the shallow-water reef-building corals of the tropics, grow in cold dark water at depths of between 200 and 2,000 meters, forming complex three-dimensional structures that provide habitat for hundreds of associated species. The seamounts and ridge crests of the Zealandian plateau, where strong currents bring nutrients from depth to the organisms that filter feed on them, are prime locations for deep-sea coral gardens, and survey cruises have documented coral communities of extraordinary richness and diversity on those structures. Those communities are extremely slow-growing and extremely vulnerable to physical disturbance. A single pass of a bottom trawl can destroy centuries of coral growth that will take centuries more to recover, if it recovers at all. The relationship between the geological history of Zealandia and the global pattern of biodiversity is one of the most productive areas of current research in biogeography. The theory of island biogeography, developed by ecologists Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson in the 1960s, predicts that the number of species on an island is a function of its size and its distance from a source of colonists, with larger and closer islands supporting more species. New Zealand presents a complex case study for that theory. It is relatively large and its exposed portion has been continuously habitable for at least the last 10 million years, but it is remote from potential source areas and was nearly entirely submerged during the Oligocene. The application of island biogeography theory to New Zealand requires accounting for the unusual history of Zealandian submergence and for the role of the submerged plateau in affecting both the distance from Australia and the routes by which dispersing organisms could reach the exposed islands. The New Zealand flora is similarly distinctive. The forests of New Zealand are dominated by ancient lineages that trace their origins to Gondwana, including the podocarp conifers, which are among the oldest surviving families of conifers in the world. The beech forests of the South Island are composed of Nothofagus species, the southern beeches, which are also found in Australia, South America, and New Guinea and whose distribution reflects the former connections of those landmasses through Gondwana. Those ancient lineages coexist in New Zealand with more recently arrived species that colonized the islands from Australia and tropical Pacific islands during the Oligocene and Miocene, creating a biota that combines Gondwanan relics with more recent colonists in a way that is unique in the world. The question of what Zealandia looked like when it was above water, and what it might have looked like had it remained above water, is one that fascinates both geologists and biogeographers. The topography of the submerged Zealandian plateau, as revealed by multi-beam sonar mapping and satellite gravity measurements, shows a landscape of considerable diversity. The Campbell Plateau to the south of New Zealand is a relatively flat and featureless elevated plateau at depths of between 400 and 800 meters below sea level. The Chatham Rise, extending eastward from New Zealand, is a narrower elevated ridge at similar depths. The Lord Howe Rise, to the northwest, is a more complex structure with seamounts and elevated banks that rise to within a few hundred meters of the surface in some places. And the New Caledonian region to the north is a complex zone of elevated ridges and basins that includes both submerged continental crust and the actively volcanic arc of the Tonga Kermatic system. If the ocean were drained sufficiently to expose Zealandia to the level of its highest submerged plains, the result would be a continent of approximately 4.9 million square kilometers, shaped roughly like an elongated boomerang oriented northeast to southwest, with New Zealand forming a mountainous spine along its eastern margin and a broad lowland plateau extending to the west and southwest. The New Zealand Alps would be the highest point of the continent, and from their peaks the view would extend over a vast lowland that is currently hidden beneath the Tasman Sea and the southwestern Pacific. That imagined landscape prompts the question of what might have been. Had Zealandia not sunk? Had the stretching of the crust been less extreme or the thinning less pronounced, an eighth continent would have been present throughout the history of the Cenozoic era. The biodiversity of that continent would have been different from the actual biota of New Zealand. The mammals that were present on Gondwana at the time of the separation, and that were apparently present on Zealandia in small numbers during the Cretaceous, might have diversified into a full complement of large terrestrial mammals, changing the character of the evolutionary history of the southern hemisphere. The climate of the region would have been different, as a large landmass at those latitudes would have affected the circulation of the Southern Ocean and the distribution of rainfall across the southwestern Pacific. Human prehistory would have been different as well. The Polynesian navigators who settled New Zealand approximately 700 years ago were among the most accomplished ocean voyagers in human history, able to navigate thousands of kilometers of open ocean using the stars, the currents, and the behavior of birds and marine life. Had there been a large continent in the southwestern Pacific, it would almost certainly have been reached by Polynesian navigators at some point during their extraordinary expansion across the Pacific. What kind of civilization might have developed on a continent of nearly 5 million square kilometers, rich in resources and positioned at the crossroads of Pacific and Australian biodiversity, is one of the most tantalizing counterfactual questions in the history of human exploration. The resources of Zealandia, both the exposed portions and the submerged plateau, have been a subject of economic interest as well as scientific study. The history of Western scientific discovery in the region that includes Zealandia begins with the voyages of Dutch and British explorers in the 17th and 18th centuries. Abel Tasman, the Dutch navigator who first sighted New Zealand in 1642 and who gave his name to the Tasman Sea that separates it from Australia, was looking for a southern continent that he believed must exist to balance the landmasses of the northern hemisphere. He found New Zealand, confirmed that it was a substantial landmass rather than just an island, and concluded that it might be part of the hypothesized southern continent. He never realized that the hypothesis was correct in a sense he could not have imagined. Beneath the waters that surrounded him, the submerged plateau of Zealandia extended for millions of square kilometers in every direction. The submarine landslide history of the Zealandian continental slopes is another aspect of the geological hazard record that is of practical importance for New Zealand. The steep slopes at the edges of the submerged Zealandian plateau, where the continental crust transitions to oceanic crust, have been the sites of numerous large submarine landslides over geological time. Those landslides, some of which involved volumes of material comparable to the largest terrestrial landslides on Earth, displaced enormous quantities of sediment into the deep ocean basins and in some cases generated tsunamis. The sediment deposits from those ancient landslides have been identified on the floors of the Tasman Sea and the southwestern Pacific, and the scarps left by the slides are visible in multi-beam sonar images of the continental slope. The recurrence of such events in the future is certain on geological timescales, and the tsunamis that could be generated by large submarine landslides on the Zealandian slopes would represent a significant hazard for coastal communities around the southwestern Pacific. The waters surrounding New Zealand and the submerged Zealandian plateau encompass one of the largest exclusive economic zones in the world, extending from the edge of the continental shelf to 200 nautical miles beyond it. Within that vast maritime territory, the seafloor contains deposits of ferromanganese nodules, rich in cobalt, nickel, manganese, and other metals of increasing economic importance for the clean energy transition. The hydrothermal vent systems on the Kermatic Ridge contain polymetallic sulfide deposits that are enriched in copper, zinc, gold, and silver. And the sedimentary basins on the submerged plateau contain hydrocarbons, including significant natural gas deposits in the Great South Basin to the south of the South Island. The exploitation of those resources raises complex questions about the governance of the seabed within the Zealandian territory and about the environmental impact of deep-sea mining in an ecosystem that is still poorly understood. New Zealand has been cautious about approving deep-sea mining permits, reflecting both the scientific uncertainty about the environmental impacts and the cultural significance of the ocean to the indigenous Maori people, who regard the sea as a living ancestor deserving of protection rather than a resource to be extracted. That precautionary stance has been controversial among those who see the economic potential of the seafloor resources as too important to forego, and the debate will become more intense as the global demand for the metals needed for the clean energy transition increases. The fishing industry that operates in the waters of the Zealandian zone is one of the most productive in the southern hemisphere, exploiting the extraordinarily rich marine ecosystems of the deep submerged plateau. The orange roughy, a deep-sea fish that lives at depths of between 800 and 1,800 meters on the slopes of seamounts and continental ridges, was one of the most commercially important species in the New Zealand fishery from the 1970s until overfishing drastically reduced its populations in the 1990s. The story of the orange roughy fishery is a cautionary tale about the exploitation of deep-sea resources. The fish was not recognized as a slow-growing, late-maturing species with a potential lifespan of more than 100 years until after the most productive fishing grounds had been depleted. The recovery of those populations has been slow and incomplete. The governance of the Zealandian territory is complicated by the status of the submerged plateau relative to international maritime law. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea allows coastal states to extend their claims to the seabed and subsoil beyond the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone if they can demonstrate that the continental shelf extends beyond that limit. New Zealand has successfully argued before the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf that its claims extend over large portions of the Zealandian Plateau, giving it sovereign rights over the resources of the seabed in those areas. But the management of those resources, in a zone that covers more than 4 million square kilometers of largely unexplored seafloor, presents challenges that no government with New Zealand's limited resources can fully address. The study of Zealandia has broader implications for the understanding of continental geology and of what defines a continent in a world where the traditional definitions are increasingly strained by new discoveries. The identification of Zealandia as a continent is not an isolated development. In recent decades, geologists have proposed the existence of several other submerged or partially submerged continental fragments around the world, including Mauritia, a fragment of ancient continental crust now buried beneath the Indian Ocean between Mauritius and India, the Kerguelen Plateau in the southern Indian Ocean, Jan Mayen microcontinent in the North Atlantic, and several others. Each of these proposed microcontinents or submerged continents represents a piece of the geological puzzle of how the current distribution of continental and oceanic crust came to be, and each requires a reconsideration of what we mean when we talk about the 7 continents. The traditional 7-continent model, which most English-speaking people learn in school, is not a geological model but a cultural and geographical one, and its categories do not correspond cleanly to the geological categories of continental and oceanic crust. The geological reality of the Earth's surface is considerably more complex. There are regions of clearly oceanic crust, regions of clearly continental crust, and a wide spectrum of intermediate cases, including submerged continental fragments, volcanic islands built on oceanic crust, and island arcs that contain mixtures of oceanic and continental material. Zealandia sits unambiguously in the continental crust category despite being mostly submerged, while many features that appear on maps as continental are sitting on oceanic crust that happens to be thick enough to form islands. The geochemistry of the rocks exposed in New Zealand provides important constraints on the thermal and mechanical history of the Zealandian crust. The metamorphic rocks of Fiordland, for example, record conditions that are characteristic of the base of a very thick crust, approximately 40 to 50 kilometers deep, heated to temperatures of 700 to 800 degrees Celsius. Those conditions are more extreme than those in the crust beneath most modern mountain belts, suggesting that the crust of Zealandia was unusually thick during the late Cretaceous, just before the rifting from Gondwana began. The subsequent thinning of the crust from that unusual thickness to the present 20 to 25 kilometers represents an enormous amount of crustal stretching, and the heat produced by that stretching and by the intrusion of mantle-derived magmas into the thinning crust was one of the factors that accelerated the subsidence of the plateau. The mineral resources of the Zealandian continental crust, including those currently exposed in New Zealand and those buried beneath the submerged plateau, reflect the geological history of the continent's assembly from multiple terrains over several 100 million years. The gold deposits of the South Island's west coast and Otago regions, which were the focus of a major gold rush in the 1860s, are associated with the metamorphic belts of the Gondwanan basement, where hydrothermal fluids circulating through the deep crust concentrated gold from the surrounding rock into veins and disseminated deposits. The shale-like deposits of the Otago schist, which were mined for tungsten during the 20th century, reflect the same hydrothermal processes. And the irons and deposits on the west coast beaches of the North Island, derived from the erosion of the volcanic rocks of the Taupo volcanic zone, have been exploited for iron ore production since the 1970s, making New Zealand one of the few countries in the world that extracts iron ore from beach deposits. The recognition of Zealandia as a continent is therefore not merely a matter of adding an eighth item to a list. It is a prompt to reconsider the entire framework by which we classify the large-scale features of the Earth's surface, and to develop a geological language that is more precise and more informative than the conventional seven-continent model. That reconsideration is already underway in the geological community, driven not just by Zealandia but by the growing recognition that the complexity of the Earth's crust exceeds the capacity of any simple classification scheme to capture. The practical implications of that reconsideration are limited. The seven-continent model is so deeply embedded in geography education and in everyday language that it is unlikely to be replaced by a more geologically accurate framework in the near future. But the scientific implications are real. A more accurate geological classification of the Earth's large-scale surface features would improve the accuracy of the models used to understand the history of the Earth's climate, the distribution of mineral resources, and the geological hazards that affect the human populations living on and near the edges of those features. The Maori people, who have inhabited New Zealand for approximately 700 years, have their own understanding of the land and the sea that surrounds them, an understanding that in some ways anticipates the geological discoveries of recent decades. In Maori cosmology, the North Island of New Zealand is Te Aikea Maui, the fish of the demigod Maui. According to the tradition, Maui fished the island up from the ocean floor using his grandmother's jawbone as a hook and his brother's canoe as a platform. The South Island is Te Waka o Maui, the canoe from which Maui fished. Those origin stories, whatever their mythological character, express an understanding that the land emerged from the sea and that the sea and the land are not separate realms but continuous aspects of a single world. In the context of Zealandia's geological history, that understanding has a literal accuracy that the creators of the stories could not have intended. The land of New Zealand did indeed emerge from the sea, pushed upward by the tectonic forces that built the New Zealand Alps over the last 10 million years, from a continental platform that had been submerged for tens of millions of years. The Maori concept of the sea as a resource and a highway, rather than as a barrier or an obstacle, also reflects the reality of the Zealandian geography. The vast submerged plateau that surrounds the exposed islands was, for the Polynesian navigators who settled New Zealand, a series of fishing grounds, navigational landmarks, and biological systems that shaped the productivity of the surrounding ocean. The upwellings driven by the topography of the submerged plateau, particularly around the Chatham Rise, produce some of the most productive fishing grounds in the southern hemisphere, and the Maori developed an intimate knowledge of those productive zones through centuries of fishing and navigation. The integration of Maori traditional knowledge with the geological and biological science of Zealandia is an active area of research and policy development in New Zealand. The Maori concept of kaitiakitanga, roughly translated as guardianship or stewardship, provides a framework for managing the natural resources of the Zealandian territory that is complementary to the scientific framework of ecosystem management. Under that concept, the obligation to protect the natural world is not merely an environmental policy preference but a fundamental cultural and spiritual responsibility, and the failure to protect resources from overexploitation is a moral failing as much as an economic one. That framework has been influential in the debate over deep-sea mining in New Zealand waters and in the broader governance of the marine resources of the Zealandian zone. The relationship between the exposed portion of Zealandia and the Maori cultural world extends to the geological landscapes that are distinctive features of New Zealand. The volcanic Taupo region, site of one of the largest eruptions in the last 5,000 years and still one of the most geothermally active regions on Earth, is central to the Maori cultural landscape of the North Island. The geothermal features of Rotorua and the Waikato region, including geysers, hot springs, and boiling mud pools, have been used by Maori communities for cooking, bathing, and healing for centuries. The volcanic mountains of the North Island, including Ruapehu, Tongariro, and Goroho, are sacred to the Maori people, who regard them as ancestors and as living entities deserving of respect and protection. The freshwater biology of New Zealand reflects the geological isolation of Zealandia in ways that are as distinctive as the terrestrial biology. New Zealand's rivers and lakes are inhabited by a suite of freshwater fish that include species found nowhere else in the world, including the galaxiids, a family of small fish that are found in cold water streams across the southern hemisphere and that were distributed across Gondwana before the supercontinent broke apart. The distribution of galaxiid species in New Zealand, Australia, South America, and Southern Africa maps almost perfectly onto the pattern of Gondwana fragmentation, suggesting that those fish were present on Gondwana before its breakup and dispersed with the separating fragments. The New Zealand galaxiids have diversified into dozens of endemic species in the rivers and streams of the islands, producing a freshwater fish fauna that is among the most ancient and most distinctive in the world. The oceanographic research vessels that conduct surveys in the waters around Zealandia encounter one of the most demanding marine environments in the world, characterized by the powerful westerly winds that circle the southern hemisphere in the latitudes between 40 and 60 degrees south. Those winds, which sailors have historically called the Roaring Forties, the Furious 50s, and the Screaming 60s, drive a persistent westerly swell that makes work on the deck of a research vessel physically demanding and sometimes dangerous. The combination of high winds, large waves, and cold temperatures makes the southern Tasman Sea and the Campbell Plateau some of the most challenging field environments in oceanographic research, and the logistics of getting scientists and equipment to and from the research area limit the frequency and duration of survey operations. The future of Zealandia research is extraordinarily promising, as new technologies make it possible to study the submerged portions of the continent in far greater detail than was previously achievable. The multi-beam sonar mapping of the Zealandian seafloor, which provides detailed three-dimensional images of the underwater terrain at horizontal resolutions of tens of meters, has revealed landscapes of extraordinary diversity and complexity on the submerged plateau. Submarine canyons cut deeply into the edges of the continental shelf, carved by turbidity currents that transported sediment from the shallow plateau into the deep ocean basins over millions of years. Coral gardens have been found at depths of between 400 and 800 meters on the slopes of seamounts and ridges, supported by the nutrient-rich currents that flow across the plateau. And on the slopes of the Kermadec Ridge to the northeast, the seafloor shows the evidence of active geological processes, including fresh lava flows from submarine volcanoes, hydrothermal vent chimneys, and the dramatic scarps produced by submarine landslides. The biological survey of the Zealandian seafloor is even more preliminary than the geological survey. Most of the deep-sea fauna of the submerged plateau has never been sampled. The species richness of the deep-sea communities on the Zealandian slopes and plateau is estimated to be among the highest in the Southern Ocean, reflecting both the geological complexity of the terrain and the influence of the productive circumpolar current that flows around the southern margin of the plateau. Each survey cruise that deploys trawls or remotely operated vehicles on the Zealandian seafloor recovers species that are new to science, suggesting that the true biodiversity of the submerged continent is far greater than current databases indicate. The climate record preserved in the sediments of the Zealandian plateau provides information that is essential for understanding the history of the Southern Ocean, the circumpolar current, and the Antarctic ice sheet, all of which are critical components of the global climate system. The sediment cores recovered by the ocean drilling expeditions have already produced important new insights into the timing and magnitude of past climate changes in the Southern Hemisphere, and further drilling in more targeted locations could fill significant gaps in the paleoclimate record. The study of Zealandia also has implications for our understanding of the evolution of New Zealand's unique biota. The identification of the Oligocene near-total submergence as the major filter event in the history of the New Zealand biota has prompted a re-evaluation of the biogeographic evidence for the timing of diversification of New Zealand's endemic species. If the ancestors of many modern New Zealand species arrived after the Oligocene, then the patterns of genetic diversity within those species should reflect that relatively recent colonization rather than an ancient Gondwanan lineage. Modern DNA analysis of New Zealand's endemic species is producing results that are broadly consistent with that prediction, though the picture is complex and some lineages appear to have survived the Oligocene submergence on the portions of Zealandia that remained above water. The story of Zealandia is also a story about the nature of scientific knowledge and about how major discoveries can be hidden in plain sight. The evidence for Zealandia as a continent was not new in 2017. The submerged plateau had been mapped by oceanographers for decades. The geological character of its rocks had been studied by New Zealand geologists since the early 20th century. The existence of a submerged continental mass to the southeast of Australia had been recognized in the scientific literature since at least the 1970s. What changed in 2017 was not the evidence itself, but the framework in which it was interpreted. A systematic analysis that brought together data from multiple sources and applied consistent criteria to the question of continent status, producing a conclusion that the evidence had supported all along but that nobody had explicitly articulated in those terms. The significance of the Zealandia discovery for the field of plate tectonics goes beyond the identification of a new continent. The detailed mapping of the seafloor around Zealandia, and the interpretation of that mapping in terms of the tectonic history of the southwestern Pacific, has revealed a region of extraordinary complexity where multiple subduction zones, spreading centers, and transform faults have interacted over tens of millions of years to produce a plate boundary geometry that is among the most complicated on Earth. Understanding that geometry requires the integration of data from seafloor mapping, seismic profiling, ocean drilling, and geological studies of the exposed rocks of New Zealand and the surrounding islands, and the synthesis of all those data sources is producing a picture of the tectonic evolution of the region that is constantly being revised and refined as new data become available. The contribution of the Zealandian region to the global carbon cycle is significant on a geological timescale. The mountains of New Zealand, actively uplifting and rapidly eroding, are a source of freshly weathered silicate rock that reacts with atmospheric carbon dioxide in the process of chemical weathering. That weathering reaction removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and eventually buries it as carbonate sediment in the ocean, contributing to the long-term regulation of atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. The rate of that weathering is proportional to the rate of uplift and erosion, and the rapid uplift of the New Zealand Alps makes them one of the most productive silicate weathering regions on Earth per unit area. The carbon sequestration by the weathering of Zealandian rocks is a small but measurable component of the global carbon budget, and its history over the last 10 million years, as the New Zealand Alps were built, may have contributed to the global cooling that characterized the Neogene period. That kind of discovery, in which a new synthesis reveals what the evidence has always been saying, is common in the history of science. The recognition of continental drift, the plate tectonic revolution that transformed geology in the 1960s, is the most dramatic example. The evidence for the fit of the continents and for the similarity of geological formations on opposite shores of the Atlantic had been available since the 16th century. But it was not until the evidence from the paleomagnetic record of the ocean floor was assembled and interpreted in the 1960s that the theory achieved acceptance. The recognition of Zealandia as a continent is a smaller-scale version of the same phenomenon. The synthesis that produces a new understanding by asking the right question of existing data. The philosophical lesson is important for science communication. The popular image of scientific discovery is of the dramatic moment when a new phenomenon is observed or a new experiment reveals an unexpected result. But many of the most important scientific advances are not discoveries of new facts but reinterpretations of existing ones, resyntheses that see the familiar in a new light. The evidence for Zealandia was always there. What was missing was the willingness to take the question of its status seriously and to apply rigorous criteria to the answer. The discovery of Zealandia also raises questions about what else might be hiding in the geological record, waiting for the right question to be asked. The floor of the world's oceans has been systematically mapped only in the last few decades, and the resolution of that mapping, while far better than it was, is still insufficient to reveal many features of geological interest. The sediment record preserved on the ocean floor has been sampled at only a tiny fraction of the locations where it exists, and the subsurface of both the oceans and the continents, accessible only through boreholes and seismic surveys, is still largely unknown at any level of detail. The Earth's geological record is vast, and we have read only a small portion of it. The connection between Zealandia and the broader history of the Southern Hemisphere extends to the human story as well as the geological one. The Polynesians who settled New Zealand approximately 700 years ago were the last major group of humans to colonize a previously uninhabited landmass. Their arrival in New Zealand completed the human occupation of the habitable portions of the Earth, a process that had begun more than 60,000 years ago when the ancestors of the Australian Aboriginal peoples crossed from Southeast Asia to a continent that had been separated from the rest of the world since the breakup of Gondwana. The settlement of New Zealand by Polynesian navigators was therefore not just an event in New Zealand history, but the final chapter in the extraordinary story of human geographic expansion. The tools that the Polynesian navigators used to find New Zealand and the other islands of the Pacific, including the stars, the ocean currents, the flight patterns of birds, and the swell patterns generated by distant land masses, were the product of thousands of years of accumulated navigational knowledge developed in the Central Pacific. That knowledge allowed them to navigate with precision across thousands of kilometers of open ocean without any instruments, finding islands that were invisible for more than 40 kilometers away and returning to them reliably across voyages that lasted weeks or months. The systematic nature of Polynesian navigation, which was as technically sophisticated in its own terms as any European navigational tradition, challenges any simple story about the superiority of Western science and technology in the exploration of the world. The subsequent history of New Zealand after Polynesian settlement is also a story of cultural encounter and transformation. The arrival of European explorers, beginning with Abel Tasman in 1642 and continuing with James Cook in 1769, brought New Zealand into the global network of European commerce and colonialism. The Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840 between the British Crown and Maori chiefs, is the founding document of New Zealand as a modern state, and its interpretation and application remain central to New Zealand politics and law in the 21st century. The relationship between the Maori people and the New Zealand state, shaped by that treaty and its complex legacy, provides one of the most instructive examples in the world of how the claims of indigenous peoples to their lands and resources can be addressed within a democratic legal framework, even if imperfectly and incompletely. The ocean current system around Zealandia is one of the most important in the southern hemisphere for the global distribution of heat and for the biological productivity of the surrounding sea. The subtropical front, where the warm subtropical water of the northern Tasman Sea meets the cold subantarctic water of the Southern Ocean, passes over the Chatham Rise to the east of New Zealand, creating a boundary between two very different water masses that is visible from space as a persistent change in sea surface color. That front is one of the most biologically productive zones in the southern hemisphere, supporting large populations of fish, marine mammals, and seabirds that feed on the zooplankton and fish that proliferate where the contrasting water masses meet. The position of the front is influenced by the topography of the Chatham Rise, and changes in the depth and shape of that submerged feature over geological time have affected the position of the front and the productivity of the surrounding ocean. The philosophical significance of Zealandia as a hidden continent resonates beyond geology. It is a reminder that the familiar is not necessarily the complete, that the world as it is known is not the world as it is. The maps that humans have drawn of the Earth for the last 5 centuries have been comprehensive in their coverage of the land surface but incomplete in their representation of what lies beneath the ocean. The ocean floor, which covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface, was largely unknown until the development of echo sounding in the 20th century, and large portions of it remain unmapped at any useful resolution. Zealandia, hiding beneath the southwestern Pacific as an unrecognized continent for the entire history of Western science, is the most dramatic illustration of how much of the Earth's actual surface has been invisible to the civilizations that have tried to map it. The geological uniqueness of Zealandia is reflected in the cultural uniqueness of New Zealand. The combination of Gondwanan relics and Polynesian culture, of ancient geological processes and modern democratic institutions, of extraordinary natural biodiversity and a relatively young human history, makes New Zealand one of the most distinctive nations on Earth. The discovery that the land beneath New Zealand is the tip of a submerged continent, hiding in plain sight beneath the waters of the southwestern Pacific, is in some ways a fitting metaphor for a country that has repeatedly surprised the world by being more than it appears from the outside. The future of Zealandia as a scientific concept and as a geographical entity is still being written. The scientific community has largely accepted the proposal that Zealandia qualifies as a continent by geological criteria, but the popular adoption of the concept has been slower. Most geography textbooks and educational materials still describe a world of 7 continents, and the incorporation of Zealandia into those materials will take time. The geological databases that record the properties and boundaries of the world's continents are gradually being updated to include Zealandia, but the process is ongoing and incomplete. And the public understanding of what a continent is and why Zealandia qualifies as one requires a kind of geological literacy that is not yet widespread. The ongoing scientific investigation of Zealandia will produce new findings that refine and extend the current understanding. Future ocean drilling expeditions will recover sediment cores from locations that have not yet been sampled, extending the geological record and filling gaps in the history of the continent's submergence and emergence. Future biological surveys will catalog the deep-sea fauna of the submerged plateau, revealing the biodiversity of ecosystems that have been developing in isolation for millions of years. And future geological analyses will refine the understanding of the tectonic processes that stretched and thinned the Zealandian crust and produced the unusual geological structure of the continent. The governance of the Zealandian zone will also evolve as the economic importance of its resources becomes clearer. The management of deep-sea fishing, the regulation of potential mineral extraction, and the protection of deep-sea ecosystems that are highly sensitive to physical disturbance will all require new institutional frameworks that go beyond the existing national and international legal structures. New Zealand, as the primary coastal state for the Zealandian territory, will be at the center of those governance discussions, and its approach will be shaped by the combination of scientific knowledge, indigenous cultural values, and economic interests that characterizes its management of natural resources more generally. The story of Zealandia is, in the end, a story about the limits of what we know and the inexhaustibility of what we do not. A continent hiding in plain sight, submerged beneath the ocean but present in the geological record for 500 million years, was waiting for a scientific question to be asked before it was recognized for what it was. That recognition, when it came, was not the product of a single dramatic discovery but of the patient accumulation and synthesis of decades of scientific data. And the recognition is not complete. There is far more to learn about Zealandia than has yet been learned, and the submerged continent will be producing new scientific insights for generations of researchers to come. Sleep now with the thought that the Earth is larger than any map has ever shown. That there is a continent beneath the ocean that most people have never heard of. That the geological history of the planet is still being written, not just in the geological record of the past, but in the ongoing research of the scientists who are learning to read it. And that somewhere in the depths of the southwestern Pacific, the submerged highlands of Zealandia are being crossed by currents of cold ocean water, hosting communities of organisms that have never been seen, preserving in their sediments a record of the deep past that no one has yet retrieved. The continent is there. It is waiting. And eventually, patiently, we will come to understand it. The eighth continent was always there. We simply needed to learn to see it. And once seen, it changes the way we see everything else. The ocean not as an absence of land but as a presence of hidden geography, the familiar not as the complete but as the beginning of a larger story, the map not as a finished document but as a work perpetually in progress. Sleep knowing that the world is stranger and richer than any map has captured, and that the strangeness is not threatening but wonderful. The naming conventions for the features of the submerged Zealandian plateau reflect the history of its exploration by different national scientific programs. Australian, New Zealand, French, and American oceanographers have all contributed to the mapping of the plateau, and the names they applied to the features they discovered reflect the conventions of their respective national mapping agencies and the cultural contexts in which they worked. Some features are named after ships or scientists, others after geographical features of the nearby islands, and others after the indigenous peoples of the Pacific whose traditional knowledge of the ocean predated the scientific surveys by centuries. The complex nomenclature of the Zealandian seafloor is a reminder that scientific knowledge is always produced by particular people in particular cultural contexts, and that the apparently neutral act of naming a geological feature is in fact a culturally laden exercise. The question of what the Zealandian plateau looked like when it was entirely above water, during the Cretaceous period before the rifting began, is one that paleontologists and paleogeographers have been attempting to reconstruct from the limited fossil and geological evidence available. The picture that emerges from that evidence is of a landmass that was broadly forested, with a warm temperate climate driven by its position at southern mid-latitudes during a period of globally warmer temperatures. The Cretaceous Earth had no polar ice caps, sea levels were significantly higher than today, and the global temperature gradient between the tropics and the poles was much shallower than in the modern world. Under those conditions, the Zealandian landmass, at latitudes of roughly 40 to 60 degrees south, would have had a climate comparable to that of modern maritime regions at similar latitudes, perhaps not unlike the current climate of New Zealand's South Island, but somewhat warmer and probably more uniformly distributed across the landmass. The interaction between the Zealandian plateau and the Antarctic circumpolar current is one of the most important oceanographic features of the southern hemisphere. The circumpolar current, which flows continuously around Antarctica in the Southern Ocean, is the largest ocean current on Earth by volume transport, moving more water past any given point than all the world's rivers combined. As it flows around the southern hemisphere, the current is deflected by the submerged highlands of the Zealandian plateau, particularly by the Campbell Plateau and the Macquarie Ridge to the south of New Zealand. Those deflections create turbulent zones where deep nutrient-rich water is brought to the surface, fueling extraordinarily productive marine ecosystems that support some of the largest populations of seabirds and marine mammals in the southern hemisphere. The Macquarie Island region, where the circumpolar current is compressed between the Zealandian plateau and the Antarctic continent, is one of the most biologically productive areas in the world's oceans. The role of Zealandia in the dispersal of organisms between Australia, Antarctica, and the Pacific Islands during the Cenozoic is a topic of active research in evolutionary biology. The submerged Zealandian plateau, while not providing terrestrial habitat for most of its history, would have acted as a series of stepping stones in the form of seamounts and shallow banks that could support communities of marine organisms and potentially facilitate the dispersal of flying or floating organisms between the exposed land areas. The flora and fauna of New Zealand include elements that appear to have arrived from multiple directions at different times, reflecting the complex history of connection and isolation that characterized the Zealandian region throughout the Cenozoic. Tracing those dispersal histories requires the integration of molecular phylogenetics, paleontology, and the geological history of the region in ways that are producing increasingly detailed pictures of how the modern biota of the southwestern Pacific came to be. The comparison between the geological structure of Zealandia and that of the other fragments of former Gondwana reveals both the shared heritage and the distinctive subsequent history of each fragment. Australia, which shares a boundary with Zealandia along the Lord Howe Rise, has a much thicker crust and has not experienced the extreme crustal thinning that submerged most of Zealandia. India, which was once the nearest neighbor of Zealandia to the north across the ancient Tethys Ocean, has traveled the furthest of any Gondwana fragment, colliding with Asia to produce the Himalayas. South America separated from Africa and developed its own distinctive biota in isolation for much of the Cenozoic. Each fragment carries the geological signature of its time as part of Gondwana and then the distinctive signature of its subsequent independent history. Zealandia's signature is the most extreme. The only fragment that is almost entirely submerged, the only fragment that preserves in its exposed remnants such an ancient and distinctive biota, and the only fragment that was not recognized as a continent for the entire modern history of science. The potential for future scientific discoveries in the Zealandian region is enormous, and the pace of those discoveries is accelerating as new survey technologies become available and as new research programs target the most scientifically valuable locations. The autonomous underwater vehicles that can conduct extended surveys of the seafloor at any depth, without the constraints of a surface vessel or human operators, are making it possible to map and sample areas of the Zealandian plateau that were previously accessible only with difficulty. The genomic revolution is transforming the study of the deep-sea fauna of the plateau, making it possible to identify species from environmental DNA collected in water samples rather than requiring physical collection of specimens. And the continuous improvement of ocean drilling technology is making it possible to recover sediment cores from locations that were previously too deep, too remote, or too geologically complex to drill effectively. The Zealandia of 2050 will be a far better understood geological entity than the Zealandia of today. The education system of New Zealand has gradually incorporated the discovery of Zealandia into its geography and science curricula, presenting it as an example of how scientific understanding can change dramatically when existing data are reinterpreted from a new perspective. For New Zealand students, the recognition that they live on the exposed tip of a submerged continent adds a new dimension to their understanding of their country's place in the world. New Zealand is not simply a pair of islands in the remote southwestern Pacific. It is the highest point of a geological entity the size of India, the emergent portion of a landmass with a history extending back 500 million years. That reframing of national geography, from a peripheral island nation to the visible summit of a hidden continent, has a cultural resonance that goes beyond the purely geological. The night diving surveys conducted at shallow seamounts on the Zealandian plateau have produced remarkable encounters with deep-sea organisms that come close to the surface under the cover of darkness. Many deep-sea species undergo vertical migration, ascending toward the surface at night to feed on the plankton that concentrates there and descending to depths of hundreds or thousands of meters during the day to avoid visual predators. On the shallow seamounts of the Zealandian Plateau, those migrating organisms can be encountered by divers at depths of only a few tens of meters after dark, providing glimpses of species that are normally seen only in the catches of deep-sea trawls or in the footage of remotely operated vehicles. Those encounters highlight the extraordinary diversity of the deep Zealandian marine environment and the degree to which it remains essentially unknown despite being only a few hundred meters below the surface of an ocean traversed regularly by ships. The story of how the paper recognizing Zealandia as a continent was written reflects the collaborative and iterative nature of modern geological research. The 11 authors of the 2017 paper were based at institutions in New Zealand, Australia, and France, and their collaboration brought together expertise in marine geology, petrology, geophysics, paleontology, and biogeography. The paper went through multiple rounds of review and revision before publication, with reviewers raising questions about the criteria being applied and the completeness of the evidence presented. The final published version was more cautious and more precisely argued than the original draft, a product of the scientific review process that, however frustrating for the authors, produced a more defensible and ultimately more persuasive case for the continent's status of Zealandia. That process, which is invisible to the public but is central to the production of reliable scientific knowledge, is one of the most important and least celebrated aspects of how science works. The ecological services provided by the submerged Zealandian plateau are enormous, even if they are largely invisible. The plateau provides habitat for populations of deep-sea species that serve as important food sources for the commercial fish species exploited in the waters above. It modifies the current patterns of the surrounding ocean in ways that affect the productivity of the fisheries that New Zealand depends on economically. It stores carbon in the sediments that have been accumulating on its surface for tens of millions of years. And it provides a physical substrate for the deep-sea coral ecosystems that serve as nursery grounds for numerous commercially important species. Those ecosystem services have never been fully quantified in economic terms, but they are substantial, and the management of the Zealandian seabed must take them into account if the long-term productivity of the surrounding ocean is to be maintained. The comparison between the geological ages of the rocks exposed in different parts of Zealandia tells a story about the assembly of the continent during the Paleozoic and early Mesozoic. The oldest rocks, found in Fiordland and in parts of the South Island's west coast, are Cambrian and Ordovician metamorphic and igneous rocks that were formed deep in the roots of mountain ranges during the assembly of Gondwana. Progressively younger rocks are found along the eastern margin of the South Island and in the North Island, recording the successive accretion of terrains from the subducting Pacific Ocean plates during the Mesozoic. The youngest basement rocks, including the Hokonui Alocthan and the Capels terrain of the South Island, were added to the growing Zealandian continent only a few tens of millions of years before the separation from Gondwana began. The geological map of New Zealand is therefore a time map, with older rocks to the west and progressively younger rocks to the east, recording the sequential construction of the continental margin. The seabird colonies of the subantarctic islands on the margins of the Zealandian plateau are among the most important breeding concentrations of seabirds in the world. The Snares Islands, the Bounty Islands, the Antipodes Islands, and Macquarie Island together host breeding populations of albatrosses, petrels, shearwaters, penguins, and other seabirds numbering in the tens of millions. Those birds range across the entire Southern Ocean during the non-breeding season, traveling thousands of kilometers in search of food and returning with uncanny precision to the same nesting sites on the remote islands. The productivity of their feeding grounds is sustained by the oceanographic conditions created by the interaction of the circumpolar current with the Zealandian plateau, making the geology of the submerged continent directly relevant to the ecology of some of the world's most extraordinary wildlife. The gravitational field of the Earth, as measured by satellite gravity instruments, reveals the structure of the Zealandian plateau in remarkable detail. continental crust is less dense than oceanic crust, and its presence under the ocean floor produces a measurable reduction in the local gravitational field compared with regions underlain by denser oceanic basalt. The gravity maps produced from satellite measurements show the outline of the Zealandian Plateau as a region of reduced gravity surrounded by the higher gravity of the oceanic crust, and the internal structure of the plateau is reflected in variations of the gravity within that region. Those gravity maps have been essential tools for extending the geological understanding of Zealandia from the relatively well-studied exposed portions to the submerged plateau, allowing researchers to infer the crustal structure and geological history of areas that have not been directly sampled. The story of Zealandia ends, for now, in the same place it began, in uncertainty and in the promise of future discovery. The continent has been named, its boundaries approximately defined, its geological history roughly sketched. But the details remain elusive, the fossil record is fragmentary, the deep-sea biology is largely unknown, and the economic resources are being debated rather than exploited. Zealandia is, in the most precise geological sense, still being formed. The New Zealand Alps are still rising, the Taupo volcanic zone is still erupting, the submarine canyons are still being carved by turbidity currents, and the deep-sea coral gardens are still growing on the slopes of seamounts that no human eye has ever directly seen. The continent is alive in the geological sense, active and dynamic, and it will continue to evolve for millions of years beyond the moment when humans first formally recognized it as a continent. That recognition is not the end of Zealandia's story. It is, at most, the beginning of our understanding of it. The deep-sea sediment record of Zealandia is not only a geological archive but also a biological one. The carbonate and siliceous oozes that blanket much of the Zealandian plateau are composed primarily of the skeletal remains of planktonic organisms, including foraminifera, coccolithophorids, diatoms, and radiolaria, that sank to the seafloor after their death in the surface waters above. Those remains, accumulated over millions of years at rates of centimeters per thousand years, constitute a biological record of the organisms that populated the surface waters of the southwestern Pacific throughout the Cenozoic. The composition of those assemblages changes over time as the climate changed, with warm water species being replaced by cold water species during periods of global cooling and vice versa during warming. Reading that biological record in the sediment cores of Zealandia provides a detailed history of the climate of the southwestern Pacific that is directly relevant to understanding how the climate of the southern hemisphere has changed over millions of years. The ice cores drilled from the Antarctic ice sheet provide a climate record extending back about 3 million years for continuous cores and up to 800,000 years for the highest quality records. The sediment cores of the Zealandian Plateau extend that record back tens of millions of years, albeit at much lower temporal resolution and with a different set of proxies for past climate conditions. Together, those two archives provide a complementary picture of Southern Hemisphere climate history. The ice cores provide high-resolution detail for the recent past, while the sediment cores provide the long-term context that allows the ice core record to be interpreted in terms of the broader trajectory of Cenozoic climate change. The integration of those two archives is one of the most productive areas of paleoclimate research in the Southern Hemisphere, and the Zealandian sediment record is a key component of that integration. The international policy implications of the Zealandia recognition are still being worked out in the context of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and the work of the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. That commission adjudicates claims by coastal states to extend their sovereign rights over the seabed and subsoil beyond the standard 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, based on the demonstration that the continental shelf extends beyond that limit. New Zealand, Australia, and France all have interests in the Zealandian territory, and their overlapping claims to different portions of the continental shelf in the region have been subject to extended negotiations and submissions to the Commission. The resolution of those claims will determine which nation has sovereign rights over which portions of the Zealandian seabed, with potentially significant economic consequences if the resources of the seabed are ever developed. The light conditions on the submerged portions of the Zealandian plateau vary enormously with depth and location. In the shallowest portions of the plateau, at depths of less than 200 meters, enough sunlight penetrates to support photosynthetic organisms including kelp, seagrass, and other macroalgae. Those shallow portions of the plateau, which include the Chatham Islands shelf and several other elevated banks, support diverse communities of organisms that are structurally similar to the shallow marine communities of the exposed coastal zones, but that occur in an entirely submarine setting. Below 200 meters, sunlight becomes too weak for photosynthesis, and the communities shift to those dependent on organic matter falling from the surface waters above or on chemosynthetic processes at hydrothermal vents and in sediments. The gradient from the sunlit shallow plateau to the dark deep plateau encompasses virtually the entire range of marine environments found anywhere in the ocean. The historical memory of the Maori people preserves knowledge of the marine environment of the Zealandian region that extends back to their arrival approximately 700 years ago, and in some cases draws on traditions that may reflect knowledge accumulated over a longer period of Pacific navigation. The Maori names for the currents, the fishing grounds, and the navigational landmarks of the waters surrounding New Zealand encode a geographical knowledge of the region that is complementary to the scientific knowledge produced by modern oceanographic surveys. The integration of that traditional knowledge into the scientific understanding of the Zealandian marine environment is a process that is ongoing and that requires both the willingness of the scientific community to take traditional knowledge seriously and the willingness of Maori communities to share knowledge that has cultural and spiritual as well as practical dimensions. The question of whether Zealandia will ever re-emerge above sea level is one that geologists can address only in probabilistic terms over geological timescales. The current tectonic situation of Zealandia, with the collision zone between the Australian and Pacific plates producing rapid uplift in the New Zealand Alps, suggests that the exposed portion of the continent is growing rather than shrinking, and that the rate of uplift currently exceeds the rate of erosion in some parts of the South Island. But the broader situation of the submerged plateau is one of continued subsidence driven by the cooling of the lithosphere, partially offset by the tectonic forces associated with the plate boundary. Whether the net effect over the next tens of millions of years will be further submergence, stability, or partial re-emergence depends on the future trajectory of the tectonic forces that are currently competing for control of the Zealandian lithosphere, and that trajectory is not predictable with any confidence on that timescale. The acoustic environment of the deep Zealandian seafloor is shaped by the same oceanographic and geological processes that produce the extraordinary biodiversity of the region. The sounds of the Southern Ocean, the low rumble of distant ship traffic, the songs of great whales traveling their ancient migration routes, the crackling of biological organisms feeding and moving, and the occasional sharp report of a submarine earthquake on the plate boundary all contribute to a soundscape of considerable complexity. The passive acoustic monitoring of the Zealandian deep ocean, using arrays of hydrophones anchored to the seafloor or suspended in the water column, is a growing research approach that complements the visual surveys conducted by remotely operated vehicles. Those acoustic surveys have detected whale calls from species not previously known to frequent the Zealandian waters, confirmed the presence of active submarine volcanoes by their seismic and acoustic signatures, and recorded the sounds of biological communities that are otherwise inaccessible to direct observation. The history of science is full of objects that were present but unrecognized, data that was available but uninterpreted, and structures that were visible but not seen. Zealandia is one of the most extraordinary examples, a continent that had been mapped, sampled, analyzed, and written about for decades before anyone assembled the evidence into a formal case for continental status. The paper that finally did so was not based on new data but on a new question. Does this submerged plateau meet the criteria for continent status? The answer was yes, and it had been yes all along. What changed was the asking. That lesson, that the most important discoveries sometimes require not new data but new questions, is one of the most practically useful insights that the history of science has to offer. If this documentary kept you company tonight, subscribe to the channel. A new world to explore every week, always deeper than the last. Zealandia will still be there tomorrow, submerged and patient, waiting for the next question.